Here at Crime Stoppers, we recently had an encounter with the New York Times that, interestingly enough, led us to the talented Ashley Rindsberg. Ashley is an investigative journalist and the author of The Gray Lady Winked.
This is a family who's controlled that newspaper for 100 years or more. Quite literally a patriarchy. They passed down the role of publisher, the most senior role of the paper, from male heir to male heir, unerringly. For 120 years, there's never been a woman. There has never been a person of color. There's never been someone who has come from outside of the family to lead the paper. And for them, it's all about status quo, meaning money, power, prestige, holding on to those things as tightly as they can at all costs, and truth being the first of those costs.
Ashley's book on how the New York Times misreporting influences history is now at the very center of the global conversation on media, journalism, fake news, and free speech. We are grateful to have spent time talking to Ashley about our experience with the Times, as well as the larger global impact of their reach. Without further ado, here's your host, Renia Mankarios.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Balanced Voice podcast. I love this podcast so much, and I love the conversations we get to have with friends around the world on behalf of Crime Stoppers of Houston. So today's guest, oh my gosh, can we just take a moment? Ashley Rindsberg, who's joining us from Israel, the author of The Gray Lady Winked, and a writer known around the world for his unbelievable work. We are thrilled to have him today. Ashley, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rania. It's great to be with you. Appreciate it.
It's an honor and a privilege. So our paths crossed because Crime Stoppers just went through a very unique experience of being written about. I'm not going to even use the word investigated by, because, a lot of people like to use that word, but it was anything but an investigation, written about by the New York Times. And I was so shocked by the process that a dear friend of mine in New York said, who you need to speak to? Ashley, who is sort of the master behind uncovering how the Gray Lady has worked historically and to date. And of course, I was familiar with your work and had your book. And now to sit with you is just unbelievable. Ashley, let's start from the beginning. What led you to do your investigative work on the New York Times, which is, I believe, is usually considered the gold standard of media journalism?
I think, like a lot of people, when there's too much faith placed in a single institution, you get the sense that something is not quite right. When everyone's doing the rah-rah about something and there's not really healthy skepticism associated with whatever that thing is, people like me who are kind of curious or skeptical, or I always describe myself as having always wanted to look around the next corner of whatever it is, if I was hiking or walking or just trying to explore what's really going on. And with the Times, I had come out of college, a New York Times reader, like so many of my other fellow students. And I at the time was reading a lot about Israel and the Second Intifada, and the picture was black and white. It was like, we have this villain, Israel, and it's just like mercilessly doing all this stuff to the other side, who are just 100% victims. Like, it was black and white. And again, there was another alarm bell to say, that's not life. That's not how things work in life. It's never that clear cut. And then I came here to Israel, and I saw it really was not what I had been reading. And that got me thinking. And then, that was just kind of going on in the background. And one day I was here in Tel Aviv, where I used to live. And I was reading this great book of history of the Second World War, or really the rise of the Nazis, called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, great journalist, great historian. And he kind of just mentions that book casually, that on the day that the news reported the outbreak of hostilities that was World War II, the New York Times ran as its lead story a piece claiming that Poland had invaded Germany and that Germany was just kind of responding to Polish aggression. And that was one of those kind of like the record like skips and the tires screech, and you're just kind of like, what? That is counter to everything we all know about World War II, which is that the Nazis obviously led an aggressive invasion of Poland as the start of its conquest of Europe. And so I wanted to understand if that was true first, and if it was true, how that could possibly be true. How could the New York Times, of all newspapers around the world, this great, even at the time, liberal bastion, report such a lie, such an obvious lie? And that's what kicked off this book, was that first chapter, that first sequence of events. And then, like I said before, I just had to keep looking around the next corner.
And the book is so interesting. And if you haven't read the book, you actually need to pick it up today. But even just going through the chapters, you start with minding the Nazis less than most, and it ends with woke history, our founding ideals were false. And I love sort of the byline of the book because, the gray lady winked, but how the New York Times misreporting, distortions, and fabrications radically alter history. So, Ashley, I'll tell you, I, like you, I hate the concept of fake news. I hate even saying the words fake news. It just riles up all these negative emotions. And if you don't like what's being said about you, you all of a sudden call it fake news. That this was something completely different. We were approached by the New York Times. They asked multiple questions. Our entire team poured into answers upon answers, showing them, audited financials, deep dives into our organization. And I started to really begin to understand that none of our answers mattered. None of the facts before them that we were presenting and, true and tried and true had any bearing on the author's intent behind the story. And so as I was reading through your book, it occurred to me that the writers create an agenda-driven piece and then pull facts, manipulate facts until they can thread a story. And the power of the paper makes that story just fact instantly. And it does alter so much. It alters a lot locally. It alters a lot nationally. But how do they do it? And how do they get away with doing it?
They do it because they're able to do it because they're skilled. They're skilled narrative weavers, and they have been doing it for so long. And to be honest with you, I think it's something that most journalists could do, maybe not at their level. It's the natural instinct that reporters can often have, which is to let me just take the story that I think is there and make the facts fit. And really good newspapers and news outlets, they put up systems and barriers to guard against that impulse of doing thesis-driven or agenda-driven journalism. And what happens is that as those barriers get eroded, which is what's been happening at the New York Times for sure for the last 20 years, it's increased in intensity and pace. Those barriers have been dropped to the point that they are explicitly no longer there, that you're explicitly seeing senior members of the paper saying, oh, well, we're not doing objective journalism. There's no such thing as objective. And that was my whole problem with the 1619 Project. It wasn't that they were trying to present a different view of American history, is that they were trying to completely rework our notion of truth from something we all kind of did our best to approximate that was objectively out there, even if we didn't necessarily have a complete grasp on what it was, but it was out there, to instead something that we kind of determined by decree. The New York Times says it's true, therefore it is true. And that is really rooted in a philosophy that they've adopted, which is sort of, it's called critical theory. It's the root of critical race theory, something we've been hearing a lot about in American culture. And critical theory said, the truth is whatever emancipates oppressed people from persecution. What does that mean? Yeah. It means whoever gets to decide who is oppressed gets to decide what is true. And that is the heart of the 1619 Project, where they are saying, oh no, America was not rooted in liberty, America was rooted in slavery. And when you look around at America today, what you're seeing are the artifacts of a slave society. You are actually seeing the echoes of a slaveocracy when you look at our government or culture or economics and finance, what have you. And that is exactly what's going on. And when you talk about an agenda, that's the key word. There's an agenda, and you might have been caught up in the bigger agenda, and that's the real problem.
So I guess, I mean, it goes against everything we understand media to be. You know, it's supposed to be truth-seeking, unbiased, not agenda-driven. And I guess, how do we think that there are people now that operate this way when the whole entire world is agenda-driven, it seems? Have people said to you, well, you know, you just don't like what they're doing, therefore you're kind of persecuting them because you don't agree with their findings? I mean, but it's like, at the same time, truth is truth and lies are lies. And the response that we have is so limited. There's not much we can do as a nonprofit in Houston that, you know, is arguing it. There's very little. Our footprint is much smaller than theirs, and it's a terrible situation to be in.
I think in today's world, it's more scary. It's more bark than bite, because so many people, I mean, when you ask me about, if people come to me and say, oh, well, you're just kind of like, you're doing the same thing, right? You're just working your own bias. That has actually never happened to me throughout the whole year that I've published the book and promoted the book. It's the opposite. I get people come to me and be like, thank you for saying that. Yes. We didn't know that other people felt this way, because no one really talks about it that much, at least until now. And these are people coming from across the board, across the spectrum politically, from different industries. People I'd never in a million years would have ever thought had a beef with the New York Times actually hate the New York Times because they see the same kind of agenda being weaponized against them. I'm talking about whole other national populations like India. Indians have this real deep resentment to the New York Times because they see this newspaper that's attacking their country on an almost daily basis. And you're thinking, why? And I've looked at the reporting and they're right. And you think, why? Okay, let's go look at the agenda. And there is an agenda. So most of the time people are saying, you've actually put your finger on something very important. But at the same time, because there's so many people who feel this way, the New York Times doesn't have the same kind of power that it once had. So when they did a real big hit piece on Tucker Carlson a few weeks back, someone, I think it was Glenn Greenwald, commented that like 10, 20 years ago, that would have been a career ender. Doesn't matter if you were right wing, left wing, whatever. Today, Tucker could hold the front page of that paper with his own face on it and smile in a photo on Twitter because he knows it doesn't really matter that much. Like it's not the kind of impact they used to have, precisely because people know they're not the same newspaper that they used to be. They are not truth seekers. I tell the story, a friend of mine used to work at the Times in the 90s. She used to have an editor there who was like a mid-level, maybe upper mid-level editor who refused to vote. And he refused to vote in elections because he was so scared that his politics would contaminate his objectivity and neutrality as a journalist, that it wasn't worth it to him. That is unimaginable at today's New York Times. It's the opposite. You would have people who are just imposing their agenda, imposing their politics on the news. And that is the norm. And I think so many people out there really know that that's what's going on.
Okay, so let's talk about the average reporter at the New York Times. I mean, are they so ingrained in their beliefs that they feel like they're doing righteous truth telling because their truth to them is the only truth? Or do you think they're saying, well, look, we know the facts are not, I mean, we're literally seeing that the facts are not what we're writing, but we have an obligation to write history, or correct history, and to report the way we want it to appear?
I think in the newsroom, it's probably a mix of the two. Okay. I think you have people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the creator of the 1619 Project, who I really think she truly does not care about the facts. And we know that in part because her own fact checkers told her that some of her most important claims, like the claim that she made that the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, was fought to protect and preserve slavery. And her fact checker, who's an African-American woman from Northwest University, told her that's just not true. Like, you just can't say it. And she said it anyway, because again, she was building a thesis, and that was like a core pillar of the thesis, and she couldn't get rid of it without knocking the thesis to the ground. So, same idea, critical theory. Truth is what emancipates oppressed people. I determine who are the oppressed people. Therefore, I am the truth teller, the truth giver. And I think then you have some of the others on the other side, the younger, more millennial woke type of journalists who really are firebrands. They're really zealous about their view of the world, and they cannot listen and look at another perspective. And that's a huge, huge blind spot for a newspaper, of course. I mean, it's all about the other perspective. It's all about a journalist being able to say, this is the piece I would have written, but the facts actually have me writing a complete opposite piece, and I'm going to write that piece anyway, even though it hurts me. That was this kind of noble, gallant kind of journalism that you used to really have more of. I think you still have some of it today, but it's a lot less than it once was. So I think it's a blend of those two. And then separate from the newsroom, of course, you've got the management, you've got the ownership, the controlling interest. This is a family who's controlled that newspaper for 100 years or more. Quite literally a patriarchy. They passed down the role of publisher, the most senior role of the paper, from male heir to male heir, unerringly for 120 years. There's never been a woman. There has never been a person of color. There's never been someone who has come from outside of the family to lead the paper. And for them, it's all about status quo, meaning money, power, prestige, holding on to those things as tightly as they can at all costs, and truth being the first of those costs.
You mentioned, that what happened to our organization, we could have been wrapped up in a national agenda. And the story on Crime Stoppers of Houston made the front page of the New York Times. I mean, printed front page. Yes, it was under the fold, but it's my sister called me. She said, "Hey, it's under the fold." What is the national agenda, though? When public safety should be a nonpartisan, we're all on the same page type of issue. Why are people infusing politics and agenda in something that's like health? Everybody wants to be healthy and everybody wants to be safe.
We've seen in the last 5 years, maybe a little more, the media has kind of put this, like, it's an us versus them narrative. And for them, the them are the powerful, the entrenched, what they would call the white elite, and the us is kind of like the masses. Like they're trying to be on the side of the masses, and partly because they actually literally are the white entrenched elite. So
that's what I was thinking as you're saying that. I'm like, but aren't they the white entrenched elite? I mean, the paper's worth what? 20? Is it 20 billion? 2 billion?
I think their market cap is about $10 billion.
10 billion. Okay.
With about 2 billion in revenue. And yes, they are absolutely the white entrenched elite. And this is the best insurance policy money could buy. Is just say, well, look at this reporting and look at that reporting. Like, never mind that, again, the top of the masthead, the executive editor who was just named, is a wealthy white man, which in my books, fine, hire the guy who's best. But according to their reasoning and their messaging, that's illegitimate. But when it comes to their own newspaper, there's no problem with it. They have no problem not having ever had in that role a woman of color or a member of the LGBTQ community, never, ever a Muslim, a Southeast Asian person. And they once again chose to put the usual archetype in that role. And they did so without any hesitation or any compunction. That's because the management, again, is looking out for their own interests. And then the reporters on the ground, they are looking to foment dissent. It's like we've heard so many times that crisis is opportunity. And when you have a national crisis, you have national opportunity. And that opportunity is to gain power. And this is what we see going on, is that if you can foment dissent, if you can have chaos on the streets, you are able to kind of loosen the middle America's grip on power. That's who should have power, is the middle of the country, just regular people. But that's exactly what we've been seeing over the course of the last 20 years. The middle class has been disenfranchised and disempowered. We've seen the rise of this new elite that are very insulated by crime. from crime. This kind of super elite that we see not just in America but around the world. It's crime on the street doesn't bother them because they're not on the street.
Yeah.
So they don't have to worry about it. And the New York Times is very much a part of that phenomenon, the people who control it. It doesn't affect them. It sells copies of their newspaper. This is another piece of the puzzle, is that the newspaper industry has shifted, news in general has shifted from advertising as the business model to subscription. They've all given up on advertising as a way to generate real revenue. The internet destroyed that. They're reverting to subscription. What that means is that if you have a total readership of, let's say, 100 million unique monthly visitors to your website, like the New York Times does per month, only a small fraction of that, maybe 2-3%, are actually going to be paying subscribers. And what that does is radicalize your content, because you end up preaching to that choir of people who are fired up, who are incentivized to pay you $10 a month forever. And those people also tend to be younger, woke millennials. So you've got another pernicious economic trend that's also driving this kind of coverage.
But where does it end, Ash? Like, where are we going from here if a paper, whether it's still powerful, not powerful? And it's interesting because many people call me and said, this is nothing. And it's to be expected at this point in this current climate. And I thought, but that's such a terrible summary of what's going on to say, you should have expected to have been targeted and written about falsely. But where are we going? And where do we get our news? And where do we get journalists that ask proper questions and truly investigate things and are okay if the outcome doesn't agree with the notion they were trying to write about? I mean, is that a lost art?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just shifting venue. It used to be something the New York Times and the Washington Post could do, and pretty much only they could do it, because nobody else had the resources to run a printing plant and a newsroom and a distribution network. I mean, that was all very expensive, resource intense, and very risky to do. Today, you don't need any of those things. You just need Substack. So what we're seeing is, former New York Times editor Barry Weiss with her own Substack. We're seeing Andrew Sullivan, a New York Magazine, former Atlantic Magazine writer, on Substack. We're seeing Glenn Greenwald, who was at The Intercept for a long time, at numerous other places before that, on Substack. And these guys are able to do that because the barrier to entry is non-existent, and they're able to bring their own voice, and they're able to speak about things without worrying about who is this going to offend, what business interests is it going to clash with, what narrative am I going to disrupt here? They're able to turn all that on its head and say, oh, actually, I'm able to disrupt the narrative. That's a good thing. I'm able to offend people. That's probably a good thing in today's environment. And I'm able to clash with somebody's business interest, also a good thing. So you have this kind of freeing effect of the internet and of these new distribution models. But the most important piece of that is the audience, is that people like you and me are interested in what those people have to say, what Barry has to say, what Andrew Sullivan has to say, what Glenn Greenwald and people like me as well, because we know that the establishment media is not serving our interests. They're serving their interests. And these other individual players, these independent people, have more of our common interests at heart. It's more about the traditional notion that there is something true out there, and let's all go do our best to find it. And Glenn Greenwald and I might disagree on a million things, but we can actually have a conversation. And that is something that the mainstream media just cannot do anymore.
In your last chapter of the book, you went through the analysis of, 2 + 2 used to equal 4. Now one can argue, does 2 + 2 really equal 4? And maybe 2 + 2 = 5. And I just kept thinking, gosh, if we have lost touch with basic truths, we're all in trouble. Ashley Rindsberg, author of The Gray Lady Winked, How the New York Times Misreporting, Distortions, and Fabrication Radically Alter History. You're incredible. What's next for you? What are you currently working on, if you're allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I am working on some really interesting reporting about the origin of the pandemic. That is something that the media worked very hard to debunk the idea that it might have come from the coronavirus studying lab in Wuhan that has the biggest collection of bat-borne viruses in the entire world. Not that it necessarily did, we don't know, but the media from early or mid-February 2020, this is before pandemic was even declared, they called lab leak a conspiracy theory spread by racist fringe elements. And that was the New York Times and Washington Post very early on, and Business Insider, and then everybody else piled on after that. So I'm working a little bit more on that, including on how another world-changing institution, this time being Harvard University, played a role in that. I've got a piece coming next week in The Spectator. And some more on those types of ideas about how institutions we once used to trust are now serving their own agenda at our expense. And we're seeing that just as you're seeing it in terms of crime. You know, we used to trust these institutions to be doing their best to serve their communities, including newspapers who should theoretically want there to be lower crime in their cities. But they're serving an agenda where that is no longer true, something we would have taken as axiomatically truth, that there should be lower crime and newspapers should be all about wanting to be having less crime in a community. That can no longer be something that we put faith in. So that's the general broad shot of what I'm doing.
And when you take on such massive institutions and such massive concepts that are tied to deep political ties and so much money, what is the pushback you feel? I mean, are you ever afraid? Are you worried? Do people try to, cancel? I think that whole cancel culture is actually gone, but do you worry about those things?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's, with the New York Times, I spoke to, before I put the book out, I spoke to one of the best IP lawyers in the US, and he was like, well, if they sue you, probably good for you. I was like, okay, so if that's the lawyer saying that, no problem. But with some of these other institutions and organizations, yeah, there's a worry. And I've had pieces killed recently because of fear. Editors told me outright, we're afraid that this or that institution is going to come after us. We in one case, this was the day before publication date. And that's kind of a mild form of it. I think other people have experienced much worse and are experiencing much worse, especially when the media comes after you, as you guys are experiencing, because that's there's something so deeply unnerving about being on the front page, even when it's good, and when it's bad, and when it's clearly agenda driven, and you've got like this massive team pursuing you, that it feels like you're hunted by wolves. So I think we're all kind of feeling that. We all have a sense that someone's out there, and if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or even think the wrong thing, you might find yourself on the wrong end of somebody else's, whatever it might be, their newspaper, their university, their whatever intelligence community. So I think this is a common anxiety shared by many people. And I think our job is to not be afraid, is to take heart that others are out there, that it's no longer a silent majority. It's like a silent super majority. It's like 90% of people, even more, who think and feel the same way. We're just all quiet. And I think it's time for us to stop being quiet.
I do think it's definitely time for people to stop being quiet. And the phrase you said, being hunted by wolves, that's exactly what it feels like. But the difference is when your audience, for us, our audience is parents who have lost their children. It's children who have, been assaulted. It's school shooting victims. It's, people who have experienced home invasions. We deal with the most broken people, and we are not going to back down. The wolves can come. The wolves can try to shred us to pieces. Their footprint is larger, of course, but ultimately we will remain committed to the families and the victims and the communities we serve, and trust that, truth will eventually prevail. Ashley, your work is so important. I just, it, but I hope you hearing it again and again and again has value for you. We encourage everybody to pick up your work and follow you. Is there a special place they need to go to be following you and staying in touch?
Twitter's a good starting place. All the links are there, and you can see what I'm doing. I just had a short article yesterday about the Pulitzer Prizes, because that's another part of the media ecosystem that deserves more thought. The New York Times has won by far more Pulitzers than any other newspaper out there, and we need to question that a little bit. So I did a big tweet thread. You can go check it out. It's gone viral yesterday and today. So that's my name. My handle is at Ashley Rindsberg. And the book's website, another good place to check out, which is The Gray Lady Winked. That's gray with an A, not an E. That's the American spelling. So, so that's it. But thank you. I appreciate what you guys are doing. I think it's enormously important. And also, more than just important, I think it shows the power of a community to make change. And I think that's also a part of this, is that we're moving away from just trusting everything to institutions, to this model that's saying, I think it's going to have to be us community members that's making the change here. And that's what it's really about. So I really do take inspiration from what you guys are doing as well.
Thank you. That means more to us than I can even say. Ashley, you're amazing. We'll be following you. And I do have a lot of thoughts about these Pulitzer Prize winners and sort of the interconnectedness of so much of it. But you are the best. We thank you for joining us from Israel. We will be following you wherever your journey takes you. And again, thank you for being on The Balanced Voice. Everybody else, we'll catch you next time. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to today's Balanced Conversation. You can find real solutions and tangible resources in our show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com. To join the conversation, follow us on Instagram at The Balanced Voice Podcast and on Twitter at @BalancedVoice_. Stay up to date on Ranya's work by following her at The Renya Report. And we can't wait to see you next week for another Balanced Conversation.